Hello and welcome to How to Manage Risk, the channel for the governance professional, aspiring professional and the risk curious. If you enjoy the content, please like, comment, subscribe and share for more risk interviews as soon as they come out. If there's anything you're particularly interested in hearing about, please let us know in the comments. We are also coming to Spotify.
Welcome to How to Manage Risk, the channel for the governance professional, board member, aspiring professional, and the risk curious. If you enjoy the content, please like, comment, subscribe, and share for more risk interviews as they come out. If there's anything specific you're interested in hearing about, please let us know in the comments and we'll do our best to cover it. We will also be available on Spotify. Thanks so much for watching. Today, I am delighted to welcome another legend of risk and banking management, Moorad Choudhry. Welcome, Moorad.
You're far too kind, Emma. You're far too kind, but thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Hello.
Well, we're absolutely delighted to have you. And now let me tell you about Moorad. He is known as one of the world's foremost experts in risk and banking management, just back from a quick trip to Hoare, where he was delivering an ALM and ALCO governance seminar. His book, The Principles of Banking, is probably the definitive text on the subject, and I will put links into where to get that in the description. Professor Moorad Choudhry is an independent non-executive director at Recognised Bank in London and non-executive director at the Loughborough Building Society. He was latterly Treasurer Corporate Banking Division at the Royal Bank of Scotland and began his city career at the London Stock Exchange. Moorad's a fellow of the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment and, as we've already said, author of a number of fabulous books. He lives in Surrey, England. Now, there's something that Moorad doesn't know I'm going to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. Phil Jenks, chairman of Recognised Bank, is quoted as saying, "Moorad has the rare skill to bring together his fellow directors, even in challenging scenarios." So I have to say, we are all in very good hands today to discuss his views on such an important topic: how to create a genuine risk culture at board level. So, Moorad, let's get into it. First question: what do we mean by genuine risk culture at board level and within the bank? What do you mean by that?
Good question. And I'm going to take the last part of it when you asked, what do I mean? You said, what do you mean by it? Because different people may define it slightly differently. Culture, one can define that quite easily just by looking at the dictionary definition. Risk culture is sort of a subset of that. What I mean about risk culture in a bank is essentially doing in real world, doing in practice what you say you do. That's what I mean by risk culture. So the risk, every bank, literally every bank in the world, that's an overused word, isn't it? Literally, I do mean it. Literally every bank in the world has a risk management framework. Every bank in the world is supervised by a regulatory authority that will insist on seeing a formal framework that describes how the bank manages all its risk. Let's think of that as, well, let's use that word, formal. That's the formal. So every bank has a risk management framework, and the larger the bank, the more systemically important the bank, the greater the breadth and the depth and the content, and indeed the very page length of that bank's risk management framework. All banks have them. So in theory, everything should be okay because they've produced a document and they've described in detail how they manage risk in the bank. And that isn't just a document. We don't leave it to that. We have a board of directors. We have a second line of defense. We have a third line of defense. We have the supervision authority, the supervisors. We have an annual process to sign off on the balance sheet strength and robustness of every bank. So generally the capital adequacy and the liquidity adequacy processes. We have all kinds of oversight, to use the regulator's definition of that word, oversight, in place at every bank. And as I said just now, the larger the bank, the more prescriptive, in fact, one could say, the more onerous it is. Now, this is a good thing. It's right and proper that banks are regulated because of the importance of their position in the economy. And it's a good thing, and it's the right thing that there is this supervision, that there is regulatory compliance, and there are rules to follow. So that being the case, we should be surprised when banks fall over. So, for example, we had the big bank crash in 08, but it wasn't just Lehman Brothers. In 2007, we had Bear Stearns and Northern Rock. And in 2009, we had, for example, KBC Bank. And then we had lots more regulation coming after that. Although we should remember, as I say in the afterword of that book that you very kindly recommended, I say in the afterword that it's not as if in 2008 we were in a Wild West environment. It wasn't a lawless environment. We had lots of regulation then as well, but we've had lots more since in response to that. The Basel Committee for Banking Supervision, they've published lots of guidance, thousands of pages of guidance since then. All the regulatory authorities around the world have taken their guidance and made it the rule of law, and that's a good thing. So why is it that banks still fall over for what I consider to be quite old-fashioned reasons? And I can only put it down to this risk culture thing. So in theory, all these banks have these risk management frameworks in place, and there is 3 lines of defense, and there is a board of directors composed of experts in their field who understand what bank management is about, in theory at least. And yet we can still see, as we did less than a year ago, reasonably large banks like the 3 banks in the US, Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic, and Signature Bank, and Credit Suisse, they can fall over. Why is that? And specifically with respect to Credit Suisse, all I can think is that the risk culture isn't the appropriate one, isn't the right one. So you asked me at the start, what do I mean by risk culture and getting the right effective risk culture in place in a bank? I would simply say that the bank actually does in practice what it says it does when it produces all these documents and publications and supervision submissions and sign-offs at the right level, at the high level. It actually does it in real. Because it's a bit like the age-old platitude. More than a few banks I've come across or observed in my life will have slogans or statements or marketing taglines that say things like, "We put the customer at the heart of everything we do." You know, that the customer is first, which is good. That's great. But the difference between writing it on a PowerPoint slide or putting it in your annual statement or putting it, on the wall in your head office, I've seen that as well. The difference between that and actually doing it is what makes the right is what risk culture is. If we actually do these things, if banks actually do them, then the risk culture is appropriate. So I guess that's my answer to that first question. And with the failures of those US banks, the change in market conditions was not unprecedented. Some people have said it's unprecedented. The US Federal Reserve raised rates from virtually 0 to over 500 basis points in an 18-month period. Well, it's not unprecedented. They did much more in the early 80s. And no one in the marketplace, whether one is the chair of a bank or the CFO or an ALCO member, asset liability committee member, or indeed anyone in a bank should think for a minute that central banks don't move interest rates. It's what they do. That's their job. So when a bank falls over because of a change in market conditions that aren't unprecedented and are reasonably conventional, changes in interest rates, changes in customer behavior, it shouldn't come as a surprise. So if that causes a problem for any particular bank's board or asset liability committee or treasurer or the C-suite, then I'm thinking, well, your ALCO terms of reference must have said we manage liquidity risk, we manage interest rate risk, we manage balance sheet risk. So that's what your ALCO is there to do, and presumably your board has approval authority over the ALCO. But you weren't doing that. So you had it on paper, we do it, but in practice you weren't. So I'm thinking the risk culture can't be right. And Credit Suisse is a very good example of that, because they were a GSIFI, a globally systemically important bank. So they would have had lots of scrutiny from their central bank regulator in Switzerland, and indeed from the ECB as a European, even though they're outside the Eurozone technically. So they would have had lots of scrutiny and lots of in-depth processes for managing risk, and they still managed to become unviable. They still managed to lose sufficient confidence in their shareholders, stakeholders, customers, etc., that they were forced sold. So why is that? And I'm beginning to think, it's not technical, it's not lack of regulation, it's not lack of technical knowledge or processes at certain levels. It's the wrong risk culture. And what banks have to have is the right risk culture. So what they say they do, this is our risk management framework, here's what we do in practice, here's how we manage liquidity risk. They actually do it. And this is a disconnect here. So if you actually do what you say you do, you've got the right risk culture at all levels of the bank. And if it turns out you're not, then you didn't. So forgive the long answer, but it was exactly the appropriate question. I thought I should answer it in some detail.
No, it's incredibly helpful. Thank you. So is it that in part risk culture, and I've gone just a question while we're here, risk culture being set from the top because then when concerns are raised, they are appropriately listened to at the time. Because as you say, risk management as a profession we know what it is there to do. It performs very effectively. And historically, we've had a situation where CROs and other people have raised concerns and they haven't been listened to. So is that really the nub of it in terms of at board level? It's not being listened to, it's not discussed, it's not considered, or there is, as you say, there isn't the culture to be able to listen.
I mean, that is related, absolutely. The concept of, well, an experience and happening occasion when the risk management department or the CRO is not listened to or raises an objection that isn't addressed. But to me, that's more in the detail. We have to get away. My personal view is we, as an industry, we need to get away from a belief, whether it's subconscious or secretly held, a belief that risk management is the responsibility of the CRO.
Yeah.
We're all risk managers. There's a reason it's called first line of defense. We're all risk managers. All of us should be thinking and managing and making decisions and having conversations that have the institution and its stakeholders at the best interest of the institution and its stakeholders at their heart. We're all risk managers. The part of the problem arises from the fact that if risk don't raise an objection, or if they're the only ones raising an objection, then it's for them. No, not at all. We're all risk managers. You kicked off your question also talking about from the top down. I am a firm believer in. There's an expression that everyone uses, tone from the top, and I'm going to use it now. I'm a firm believer in that because culture is set. The tone is set from the top. I don't know about others who are watching today, but I've never walked into an office, whether it's a trading floor or an open plan office, and seen a vibrant, engaging, open, collaborative culture, and the senior exec are the opposite. And I've never walked in to an office or a trading floor or any environment where the culture is closed and not collaborative and very political, and the senior executive are the opposite. It just doesn't happen. The tone does come from the top. So it's very important for the board and the C-suite and the levels below them, the delegated authority, to follow the tone from the top and work towards inculcating that right culture, that collaborative shared objective. I don't want to speak in cliches or platitudes, but it's important that when we are at an ALCO meeting or a board meeting, that it's the institution as a whole and all the stakeholders that we're considering, and if whether it's a CRO raising any objection or anyone else in the meeting, we should be having that conversation. And openness and a challenging but open environment where everyone feels free to speak. The expression these days is psychological safety. I read that, something about Google. I think it's the company Google, an expression called psychological safety, an atmosphere where anyone, irrespective of their seniority, feels free to speak up without thinking it's going to be a career limiting move or getting out of opprobrium. If the tone from the top sets the right psychological safety level, you're well on the way to having a good, it's not the whole ingredient, but you're well on the way to having the appropriate risk culture in place if there is psychological safety. So that's not my expression. I read it recently about how Google manages teams. So if people feel free to speak, then and voice their opinion, irrespective of their seniority, particularly in committee meetings, then that's the right way. We're on the right road to getting the right risk culture in place.
Mm-hmm. And I had on my list as the next question, well, I think it's in part answered. Risk culture. I said, why is risk culture important? Well, we've clearly demonstrated, and you've clearly talked about why it's important. But in a nutshell, is there anything that you would like to add? Because it's a commercial importance, isn't it? It's not a fluffy flim flam. Oh, we have a great culture. It's not that.
Spot on, absolutely. Because that's the platitude. That's the easy bit. It's easy to say that we have a great risk culture. Like it's easy to say we put the customer at the heart of everything we do. It's easy to say these things, and in fact, it's easy to say them because they're unarguable. If I stand up in front of an audience of anyone, my peers, other stakeholders, any interested party, and say, we believe risk culture is important and we have a good one, or the customer is very important, no one's going to argue with me. It's an unarguable statement, which makes it a platitude. So it's not enough simply to say it. We've got to make it happen. And a few presentations posts I've done recently talk about steps that one can take to go about trying to have comfort at any level, whether it's the board right at the top or an exec committee or the ALCO or simply a senior management or a senior leadership team, how can we have comfort that we are inculcating or building the right risk culture? And it's things like, the people who are promoted to senior positions, do they have a track record of encouraging this? Is the atmosphere in the meeting one where everyone feels free to speak? My tip for chairing meetings is always to invite everyone to air their opinion before I've aired mine, because I want to hear everyone's opinion. Some chairs are fantastic chairs. You very kindly quoted Phil Jenks, and I'm very happy to say that he's an absolutely unbelievable chair. I've got nothing but the greatest time and respect and admiration for him. And every time I attend a meeting that he chairs, I'm learning something. So some chairs are fantastic, not just chairs of boards, but chairs of any committee, and some of them less so. And it's important that culture is led from the top. And if we are encouraging open speaking and challenge without any fear of career limitation, then we're on the right route. So it's not enough just to say these things. We've got to proactively make sure that they're in place. And that's the challenge. That's the hard part.
Yeah, I understand. And you've mentioned a part of this in the conversation, which is great. So realistically, how does a board ensure that they've got good risk culture at board level and within the bank overall? We've talked about psychological safety and ensuring it's not career limiting. As you've said, I know on your LinkedIn page, you've gone through some really interesting thoughts on this as well, Moorad. But if you could summarize for us your key thoughts on how do we get this done? How do we make sure it happens? And not just within financial boards and organizations, but also within corporates, because obviously the fundamental principles apply.
Absolutely. Let's take, absolutely right. Let's take the question. Let's raise the level of the question. Let's not just think banks, any corporate entity, any gathering together of commercial enterprise that requires a management team to run it. And this is the challenging part. And you've asked it, and I will attempt to answer it in a way that isn't just more platitudes. The tone from the top is important. So the board, being the board, isn't at the coalface. They're not there every day. They're not dealing with the teams who deal with customers. They're not in the office every day. It's just the nature of the role. So they have delegated that authority and responsibility to the exec, but they still have that tone from the top authority. So they need to make sure that the people that they are putting in those positions follow their, or are in line with their approach, the psychological safety, the collaborative approach, the collegiate approach, the open speaking, the relish for debate. You can see that at the board. You can see that amongst the senior execs, the C-suite. So if they are of that ilk, then the board can have a bit more comfort that at the lower levels, at the coalface, that's being pursued as well, because they are following the same sort of culture. They're not going to know. They're going to rely. The board relies on the exec to a certain extent. It's because of the nature of the role. They are non-executive. They're not there full time. So only the executive director is there full time. And the execs rely on their senior leadership team and those below them to enforce, or enforce is the wrong word. See, I've fallen into the trap of thinking, you will do this because I say it. No, it's not like that at all. It's not enforcing. It's encouraging. It's building the right culture. So if I was to put a team together, I would want to, first of all, make sure that it represented diversity of thought. But secondly, I wouldn't want to stuff it simply with people who always agreed with me or people who weren't as technical, who were less technically knowledgeable. I would want to have experts in the room who were happy to challenge me and agreed with me partly, and sometimes thought, well, let's do it like this more. I'd want that sort of team. Now, if I have that team around me, I've got a bit more comfort that they will have that team around them. I won't know that for sure, but that's a good start. And also, again, from the board level down, it makes a lot of sense to get to know, to be at the coalface at times, to get a feel for the culture. It's very important to have as much contact with as much parts of the organization, irrespective of one's level, as much as possible. We mentioned the 3 lines of defense. In the UK, for example, it's quite common for the internal audit function, the 3rd line of defense, to be outsourced. Now that has its that model has its adherents, and it works perfectly fine. I've got no negative feedback on that, or it just is what it is. But if you look in other countries in the world, it's still the case that the internal audit function is part of the firm. The 3rd line of defense is part of the firm. Now, I raise this as an example because, again, to really get a feel for the atmosphere, the environment, the culture of a place, one has to be there. One has to be in the office. You know, it's what do they call it? The American expression, the water cooler conversation or something like that. One has to be there. It's not just the Zoom call or having the meetings in the committees. It's being there, gauging the atmosphere, gauging the feel in the room. You know, the environment. And the third line of defense is part of the 3 lines of defense framework by definition. And being in that culture, I would have thought, would assist them to get a feel for it. So I use this as an example, whether one is at the board level or the lower level or senior executive or level below that, second line defense or third line defense, get a feel for the culture and the atmosphere in that room. And if it does exhibit psychological safety, there is an open collaborative environment, then you're on the right track. And everyone's got to think like that. They don't have to have the same view on decision making. Finance is a very finance is a very subjective discipline. You know, it's as much art as science. It's not like physics. You know, I know that there are mathematical models galore in banking and finance, but they are estimations and approximations. There's a fantastic quote that no one seems to be able to tell me who originally said it. I thought a gentleman, a friend of mine, Tanveer Bhatti, I thought he said he quote, but he told me it wasn't him. It's all models are wrong, but some are useful, something like that. So models help finance work, but they're not an accurate representation of reality at all times. By definition, they're approximations and estimations. So we need to get a feel for the environment that we're in and try and work around that, build around that, and that will help us to get the right risk culture. It's a challenge, but if we are working in an environment, irrespective of our seniority, where there isn't this environment, then if there's any way we can influence it, then great. And as I said at the top, it's harder to influence the more junior you are. So the tone from the top is very important. They're the ones that have to go about getting this right environment so that the risk culture is the right one. So again, forgive the long answer, but it's hard to pin down. It's not something that you can write in a textbook and say, here is the formula to do it. I have got steps in that presentation I referenced about 6-7 recommendations to try and build effective risk culture. For example, the people you're promoting to senior positions have to reflect that same zeal and same view on what makes good risk culture. But there's, at the end of the day, it's a gradual process that one works through. It's almost iterative. You can't get it right from the start on day one necessarily. You might do if you're lucky and you have all the right people in the team around you, but it's a gradual process to get to, and you want to try and build that psychological safety as part of that process.
Thank you. And are there any poster children organizations of people who get this right, in your opinion? Obviously, bearing in mind whether we're looking from the outside in, because you're not going to know unless you're actually there, or one that you've come across and you've just thought, do you know what, you guys and gals, you got it.
I'm not, that's a great question, but I'm not sure. I'm obviously all of us, yourself, myself, I started in 35 years ago in the City of London. The people watching this video may have spent 35 months or 3 months or 35 years or longer. They will have come across firms that had a better working environment. By better, I mean a more appropriate risk culture environment. They've come across firms that didn't. I've been privileged to work at all the firms. I've been associated with all the firms I have been in my career. I think if I'm going to call one out, I would call out Hoare Govett Securities, which was led by the legendary Sean Bagley. I was there from 92 to 97, and he was old school, and by old school I mean that as a compliment. Apparently old school is seen as some not a compliment these days, but by that I meant he was a gentleman. He wasn't obsessed, for example, with maximizing P&L, which is not something one often says. He was the head of the fixed interest business units in the bond trading desk. We were ultimately gilt-edged market makers as part of ABN Amro Bank, and his team was very relaxed like that. He brought in people based as much on their character as on their technical expertise, for example. And that was a very friendly environment. I mean, I started there as a junior, a blue button we're called. I was the junior, I was the trainee, and by the time I left, I was running my own book. Whether I always felt supported by him. His senior exec were the same. and he was very encouraging. He always had time for me. Govett as an institution was a bit like that. The chairman, Peter Meinitz-Argen, who passed away a few years ago now. I mean, I just joined the firm. I was a complete unknown. I was a junior, and yet he saw me on the lift. He saw me in the lifts one day. We're talking about the chairman of the firm here. He saw me in the lifts. It was just me and him. And he said, and I'm kind of nervous looking down at my feet as the chairman. I'm the nobody, the new kid. This is back in, I think it was 92, was it? And he suddenly goes, "I hear congratulations are in order." I'm thinking, "Sorry, sir." And he goes, "You've passed your institute exams." I was flabbergasted.
Wow.
Knock me down with a figure. You could knock me down with a feather. You could knock me down with a feather. How on earth did the chairman know that the most junior person in his firm, who'd only been there about 6-7 months, has just passed his security? It was then called the Securities Institute. Has passed his Securities Institute. So how on earth did he know that? I thought, gosh, I would follow you to the ends of the world. I never had much to do with him. He was the chairman. I was the absolute newcomer junior, and yet he knew that about me. Now, how many chairs of banks or any firms would know that about their most junior person? Now, you could say to me, "Well, hold on a minute, Hoare Govett, there are only about 300 employees there. You weren't exactly a GCFE bank." Fair enough. Why don't you find me, a bank with less than 1,000 employees, and then if a chair knows about the professional qualification position of one of his or her most junior employees, you've got a great culture. And Sean Bagley was in the same mold. That team was very friendly, very supportive, very encouraging. And remember, it's an aggressive environment because we were bond traders, but it was nothing like what I hear about the environment in some of the other firms, which I don't need to name, but you can probably guess. It was just what I call old school. And to me, that was a fantastic risk culture, because it was a fantastic culture, full stop. We were supportive of everyone. So I'd call them out, but that's a historical name. The name has been lost to history. It doesn't exist anymore. But I've answered your question with that example because, like I said, right from the top down, it was very supportive and encouraging. And even though one had to be knowledgeable technically to do that role, that wasn't the be-all and end-all of it. And it wasn't an obsession just with P&L. It was about the greater picture. So, someone could point to me and say, "Well, there you go. That's why they got taken over and the name doesn't exist anymore." But, fair enough. I think, one could say an obsession with P&L is what has been the undoing of some failed firms. And I'll leave the viewers to draw their conclusions on that. Failed banks in the last, since 2007. But I just that anecdote with Peter Meinitz-Argen, I'll never forget that. And I've not come across it since. I was absolutely flabbergasted. He hadn't been introduced to me. So I hadn't been introduced to him. I'd just joined the firm and I'd been there a few months and I'd sat the exams as part of my professional qualifications, my professional development. And yet he was aware of it. And to this day, and he passed away about, 7, 8, 10 years ago, but rest in peace, Peter. But to this day, I never found out how he found out. He just did. And we were in the lifts, an awkward moment. And I don't need to name any names, but I've been in lifts in offices with senior execs who just ignore me. Okay, so I don't need to name any names. But he not only knew who I was, which in itself was a surprise, he actually spoke to me in the lift, right? Fantastic. I'll never forget that. That's 32 years ago now. I'll never forget it. What an absolute legend of a chair. And again, Sean Bagley, who was part of the senior team at that institution, same, a real gentleman.
I think that's
great. That to me is great culture. Full stop.
It's an absolutely brilliant example as well, because what that says to me when we look at risk culture is you can feel it when you see it. You've had somebody and you've remembered it for all of those years, and it's been quite formative in your career. Absolutely. And I think that's the essence of it.
Yes, you're spot on. You've articulated it better than me, actually, and thank you. One can feel it, and one will know it. One experiences it. You'll just know then. And that. And I wasn't expecting that question, and I hadn't thought of that. It's not going but once you asked it, all I could think was, yes. When do you know you're in the right place? And as I said, Sean Bagley, an absolute legend. Peter Meinitz-Argen, R.I.P. Rest in peace. You're an absolute gentleman, sir. And I will never forget that moment. I would, at that point, I thought, gosh, I would follow you anywhere. Let me carry your bags for the rest of your career. He was brilliant.
Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Moorad, for your time today. As I said, I will put a link into your absolutely fabulous book. And everybody do look up Moorad Choudhry on LinkedIn. I'll put a note to his LinkedIn, because Moorad's brilliant, because he updates constantly with new things that come out and thoughts and cohesive thoughts. I think there's a new piece on climate that you've just done, and it's there for everyone to read. And I really respect that. So thank you so very much for your time today. I'm very, very grateful. And
you're very welcome. It's my pleasure. Always a pleasure to chat to you, Emma. Thank you.
Lovely to see you. Thank you.